Today, we're diving into a true crime case from the 1980s that is just truly chilling. It's a story about manipulation, absolute control, and a string of horrific murders. But these crimes weren't committed by some lone wolf killer. They were committed by a married couple. And that right there is what makes this case so deeply disturbing. You know, back in the early 80s, when young women started vanishing across California, the threat wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in an alley. It was a husband and wife, hiding their terrible secrets in plain sight. So let's start with this partnership. Gerald and Charlene Gallego, they twisted the very idea of romance and trust into weapons. They built this facade of just total normalcy that hid an unimaginable nightmare for the people they targeted. To really get a handle on their crimes, we first have to understand the people themselves. Their relationship. That was the engine driving all of this. So who exactly were Gerald and Charlene Gallego? Okay, so when you put them side by side, the dynamic is, wow, it is stark. On one side, you have Gerald. He was a diagnosed narcissist with a documented history of sexual violence, completely driven by this need to dominate. And then there's Charlene. She came from a really unstable background, she was totally isolated, and completely dependent on him for money. This power imbalance wasn't just a small part of the story, it was central to everything that happened. So, the big question is, how does a toxic relationship like that spiral into a full-blown murder spree? Well, they developed this incredibly calculated method, which is what earned them that awful nickname, the Lonely Hearts Killers, because they preyed on people who were just looking for a connection. Their method was horrifyingly effective, and it had 4 clear steps. First, Charlene would be the one to approach a young woman. Her being there just immediately lowered their guard. Then, Gerald would show up, playing the part of the charming boyfriend. Once they had their victim isolated, they were abducted, tortured, and murdered. Then their bodies were just left in remote spots across California and Nevada. And the scale of what they did is it's staggering. Investigators believe Gerald was responsible for at least 10 murders. But that little plus sign you see, that represents the terrifying possibility that there are more victims we just don't know about. And we have to remember, behind that number are real people, teenagers, young women. So many of their families went years without knowing what happened. It is so important to remember these weren't just statistics in some old case file. They were vibrant lives that were stolen in the most brutal way you can imagine. So you have to wonder, how does something this monstrous finally stop? Well, the downfall of this deadly duo actually came from within. The very same control and fear that fueled their crimes is what ultimately tore it all apart. In a shocking turn of events, in 1980, Charlene fled. She was terrified that she was going to be his next victim, so she went to the authorities. Her testimony was absolutely crucial. It led directly to Gerald's conviction and a death sentence in 1984. He ended up dying of natural causes on death row, way later in 2018. And this is the part of the story that is still so controversial today. In exchange for testifying against her husband, Charlene Gallego was given full immunity. She walked free. This, of course, raises the question that still haunts this case. Was that justice? On one hand, prosecutors argued they absolutely needed her testimony to guarantee a conviction. But for the victims' families, letting someone who was an active participant in these horrors go free felt like a profound, unbelievable injustice. You can see why this case leaves us with so many difficult questions about guilt and complicity and control, and that's why, even decades later, it is just so unsettling to think about. The whole debate over Charlene's role really comes down to this concept, coercive control. And this isn't about one single action. It's about a sustained, relentless pattern of psychological abuse. I mean, think about it. You have Gerald's documented history of violence and his narcissistic need for total domination, combined with Charlene's complete financial dependency and her isolation. It created the perfect storm for this to happen. So, was she a willing, cold-blooded accomplice? Or was she a victim herself, so psychologically broken that she was just acting to survive? The legal system made its choice, but the moral debate, that's still very much alive. Ultimately, the Gallego case is a really dark reminder of some pretty uncomfortable truths. That evil isn't always a solo act, that manipulation can disguise itself as love, and that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from a stranger, but from those we're taught to trust the most. And that leaves us with this final haunting thought. The story of the Lonely Hearts Killers is a terrifying reminder of how intimacy itself can be twisted and used as a weapon, forcing us all to question, how well can you ever really know the person closest to you?